I think one of the things you may have noticed that through all the sessions this morning, there has been a background theme, which is, though we are talking a lot about SDN in terms of network infrastructure, it is not just about network infrastructure. It is about services and applications. So what we wanted to do in this panel was really dive deeper into services and applications and how they need to evolve in this new programmable SDN world. For that, I'd like to invite Sangeeta Anand, and she's former general manager at SafeNet, and Chad Kinzelberg, senior vice president of business development and corporate development at Palo Alto Networks.
So thank you, Kanhaiya, and Chad, thank you for joining us this afternoon. So as Kanhaiya mentioned, the conversation this morning has been largely around infrastructures, whether we call them SDN, SDI, and we are switching topics a little bit to services. And I'm sure all of you would agree that perhaps the first service, the first amongst equals, really becomes security services. And that's what we are going to focus our next 15 minutes on. And so Chad, getting started, right, we are talking about SDN as a key transformation, key change of the infrastructure and the services delivered through this infrastructure. And while we are still in the relative early stages of SDN, in the very early stages of SDN, customers have begun looking at what does this mean for them. Some of them have begun blueprinting SDN for their data centers and IT organizations. What are the customer issues and what are the security issues customers should be aware of as they're looking at this SDN transformation?
Right. So SDN is a pretty fundamental shift in network architecture. And so if you make those kinds of fundamental shifts in network architecture, it's inevitable that there are changes necessary in terms of security. So if we go back and just look at the old paradigm in which you know that there's a few places where the traffic is going to flow through, and you can strategically place a couple of network devices that will basically inspect all the traffic at certain ingress and egress points, and know that you've got a protected network. If you move to an SDN world, look, there's all kinds of benefits in terms of productivity and cost reduction, but there is a drawback, and the drawback is that whole security model that you put in place that relied on those few strategically placed network devices begins to fall apart. Suddenly you have an environment in which any node can communicate with any other node, and you really don't know whether or not there's going to be inspection and the proper security policy applied. And so what that necessitates is rethinking the security model and ultimately trying to push that security functionality down to the nodes, down to the hosts that are governing over the different virtual machines, and you can't rely on that physical appliance model that's worked so well for the last 10 or 15 years. So I think that's one important security issue that comes as a result of SDN. And the other just has to do with the building blocks for SDN. So if we look back at the old paradigm, the networking equipment was largely provided by a few vendors, and all of the protocols and all of the underlying technology were proprietary and closely held. So hackers really didn't have the luxury of looking at the source code, inspecting it, figuring out what the vulnerabilities are, et cetera. Now let's switch to the SDN paradigm, where things are based on OpenStack and OpenFlow and other open source projects. Look, I'm a huge advocate of open source, and there's a lot of benefits, but the reality is every single hacker in the world is looking at that code and is scrutinizing it for vulnerabilities. And if we're really honest about how it will evolve, there will be cyber criminals that contribute code to those efforts. And they can have backdoors, and they can avail themselves of those backdoors as, say, OpenStack starts to really permeate a lot of organizations, and it's no longer just in a trial mode, but it's actually in full deployments. So there are risks around that are going to have to be grappled with at some point.
Okay. So, when we look at the past 15 plus years, security architectures have evolved fundamentally with layers of breach prevention, security being layered on top of each other, access controls, and just a myriad of products. Simultaneously, the networking vendors have been really at the forefront of embedding as part of the intelligent network paradigm, embedding security in the network. So how will SDN change the security architecture?
Right. So, I mean, the way that you described security is really a sad result of some of the fundamental problems with the stateful inspection firewall. And what's happened over, say, the last decade and a half is we started with a firewall and started to layer on all these other technologies that we call firewall helpers, IDS, IPS, web filtering, whatever it happens to be. And it's a fundamentally flawed approach given the current threat landscape and given the nature of the way that people use applications and applications that kind of circumvent the normal firewall technology. So even before we start talking about SDN, that security model is broken. And candidly, that's why at Palo Alto Networks, we've had a lot of success saying you need to have a different architecture, a next generation approach that really has an application user-centric way of governing over traffic and putting in place a security model. The importance of that only gets magnified in an SDN world. Because if you go back to what I was describing where, gee, you want to push all of the security down to the nodes and make sure that you're closer to protecting those assets, you can't have something as complicated as one layer after another, stitched together, running on each one of those different virtual machines. The cost, the complexity, and the performance degradation will just make that unwieldy. And so if you're going to do that, you have to have a well-conceived, integrated approach, a next-generation approach to network security. So I think that's the first thing that SDN really, I don't want to say ushers in, but it accelerates the adoption because it just isn't going to work in a virtual world. I think the second thing is if you look at the impediments to virtualizing more and more workloads, there's been a couple things. One is networking, and the second is security. So SDN is all about trying to eliminate that networking bottleneck, and if we can abstract the networking layer and make things more agile, then we'll be able to roll out these virtual workloads a lot more rapidly. The next step of that is security. You can't have security now be the long pole in the process. So tying security into all of the orchestration systems, into the management layer, and just making this a seamless part of rolling out SDN is another change that has to happen from an architectural perspective.
So from a product perspective, are we looking at a transformation then from security has really been sold as largely appliances, proprietary appliances, hardware modules inside switches and routers? You see a change happening in that?
I do see a change, and like SDN itself, I think it's going to be gradual. When we talk to our largest customers, which are generally G2000 type customers, they're testing the waters, and a lot of this is in test and dev, and it's not necessarily in their mission critical applications. But I think that transition happens over the course of the next several years. And look, there's always going to be a place for a physical appliance just in terms of throughput and at the perimeter. But when we're talking about the virtualized data center and private clouds and public clouds, it really lends itself to a virtual form factor, and that virtual form factor needs to be as seamlessly as possible integrated in at the orchestration layer. So I think if we're talking about network security in the data center and we look out 4 or 5 or 6 years, I have to believe that most of that is going to be done with virtual appliances.
So we talk of SDN as a transformation. We are also talking about cloud and the mobile internet as two other very transformative phases we are going through. So from a security perspective, are the changes which are being driven by these three transformations similar? Are they in opposition to each other? And what is Palo Alto Networks' view on it? How are you addressing these three transformations with respect to security? Okay.
So I think you've really identified the most important secular trends that are impacting network security. And and perhaps it makes sense to kind of break them up and talk about cloud and then talk about mobility. And I think that SDN and cloud are inextricably tied, right? Moving to a virtualized data center model, and what I described before as, well, what are the impediments that are holding this up? Well, if it's networking, well, that's why we're talking about SDN. SDN is designed to solve that problem. So I think that there is a very strong and direct relationship to saying, as there's interest in adopting cloud services, there's an interest in making in SDN. So in terms of what Palo Alto Networks is doing with respect to cloud, it's probably constructive to talk about in two different ways. There's actually protecting virtualized data centers, private clouds, public clouds, whatever nomenclature we want to use. And then there's using the cloud as a delivery mechanism of security. So when it comes to protecting private and public clouds, last year we introduced our VM series. And the VM series is a virtual appliance that embeds all of the goodness that people have come to expect from a Palo Alto Networks firewall. So the whole application and user-centric way for securing networks is wrapped up in a virtual form factor that runs on, for now, runs on the VMware hypervisor ESX. And we've talked publicly about supporting the other hypervisors as well. So that was an innovation to kind of address this cloud adoption. And the second one was something that we call dynamic objects. And the idea behind dynamic objects is to be able to tether security policy to a particular virtual machine such that as VMs are provisioned, moved around, deprovisioned, you always have the right security policy applied to that particular application or set of applications for those groups of users. So the same thing that we've been able to do kind of on a physical network or a VLAN now applies there. And the way that we design dynamic objects is with an API. So all the orchestration tools out there, whether it's VMware or OpenStack, those are the two that we see most common. It's easy to tie in and then just have security be part of your natural workflow for rolling out SDN. So that's the first part in terms of protecting the cloud. The second part on how do we use the cloud to deliver security, there's a whole set of business people that as soon as you hear cloud, they start to get very frightened in terms of security and privacy. And I think in some cases, there are good reasons to have those concerns, and in other cases, there aren't. And in all fairness, there are industries, and I'm thinking particularly around financial services and government agencies, where you're just not going to do security in the cloud, at least not in the next several years. But there are a lot of applications that make sense from a security perspective to do in the cloud. And one of them is a service that we have called Wildfire. And Wildfire is our advanced persistent threat detection and prevention service. And so you've heard advanced persistent threats or APTs. Anytime you hear about the Chinese cybersecurity and all of this very targeted malware, that falls under the general umbrella of APTs. And the distinguishing factor of APTs versus a run-of-the-mill virus is the P part, the persistence. And the idea is that this malware doesn't just readily show itself. The nastiness kind of manifests over time. And so in order to detect it, you have to run that particular file for a period of time and see what happens. And so this is a perfect case where using the cloud makes a lot of sense. So what we do is we see the suspicious files traversing the network. We send it up to our cloud. And in the cloud, we have a virtual sandbox. And in that virtual sandbox, we'll run the code. We'll see if there's any indicators of compromise, and we're looking for hundreds of different activities. And if, in fact, it is malware, we characterize it, write a signature, and then push those signatures down to the firewall. Now, if you didn't do that in the cloud and you try to do that on-premise, and you start talking about thousands of files traversing the network, you really quickly run into a scale problem. How are you possibly going to process all these things for an extended period of time to see what unfolds? It just doesn't work. So it's a great example of where it really lends itself to the cloud. And expect more of our functionality to be delivered via the cloud over time. I think that this is it's an evolution. It doesn't happen overnight. The last piece that you talked about was around mobility. And, what's happening is the distinction between what is on and off the network is being blurred. And you've got people that, even in the most secure enterprises that have embraced BYOD, that are showing up with iPhones and Android devices, and want to have all the same rights and privileges with respect to network access and application and data access, et cetera, that they enjoy when they're on the network. So how do you do that? And there's a lot of different people trying different ways to do it. What we've done is we've introduced a product called Global Protect. And the basic idea is all the policies that you've set inside of your Palo Alto Networks firewall in terms of how to safely enable applications for a certain set of users, all of that applies to your iOS and your Android platforms. We have a little client that runs there, and basically you adopt all of those policies. So, I think that mobility is, kind of the last major trend that is having an impact on network security, and we're still all grappling with this. We have a model right now that works well for cases that say, yeah, I'm willing to put an additional agent on my client, and that works for some customers and not for others.
Excellent. So Chad, we are just running a little over our time, so just quick 30 seconds. It's an entrepreneur conference.
Okay.
And I'm sure there are folks here thinking, so what's the next big idea for the next Palo Alto networks?
Right.
So just a quick summary of some of the areas of innovation you can share with our entrepreneur community.
I'm in a little bit of a tough position in the sense that, I'd like to give some general advice in terms of building the next Palo Alto networks, but we're pretty keen on being the next Palo Alto network. So, having said that, I think some of the things that I mentioned earlier really are entrepreneurial opportunities, right? So, okay, big picture, fundamental change in network architecture. That means new exploits, new attack vectors. How can I possibly harden the things that are going on in terms of OpenStack and OpenFlow and layer on top of what's already out there? These are big issues for enterprises that are looking at SDN. And of course, you're going to be competing with us and a lot of other security vendors. But there's enough disruption that I think that these are kind of billion-dollar opportunities. A second area is just around orchestration. One of the things that's really becoming clear is the old model, the kind of CA, BMC orchestration tools don't really seem to have much traction in an SDN environment. And so entrepreneurs that are clever and thinking about, well, there's already stuff going on at the server level, so I've got some compute that's virtualized, but now people are doing it for networking and for storage and for security. Inevitably, there's a lot of complexity associated with that. So being able to manage that in some sensible way seems like another good opportunity.
Well, you'll be joining us for lunch over here. So folks, for any of you with additional questions for Chad, I just want to say thank you very much.
Thank you, Sangeeta. Thanks, everyone.
We are fortunate to have one of the industry's thought leaders, Dr. Steve Herod, ex-CTO of VMware, here for our afternoon keynote. So please try and get here at 1:55. What's on deck? We talked a lot about the network infrastructure this morning. In the afternoon, we are going beyond networking, and we are talking about how SDN, or a programmable network infrastructure, that whole concept applies to storage. And then how do you go about managing this programmable infrastructure? So that's what's on deck for this afternoon. Looking forward to seeing you at 1:55. Thank you.